The planet has no name anymore, only a designation stamped on shipping manifests and tithe records that nobody living has ever seen. I tell you this because names matter to the living, but here, the living are temporary and the dead are permanent. The miners call it Graveheart, though never where the overseers can hear. It is a fitting name for a world that has been gutted so thoroughly that its core temperature dropped 3 degrees in the past century. The Mechanicus tech adepts who monitor such things call this a statistical anomaly. The miners know better. They know the planet is dying, and they are killing it one shovel load at a time. You wake before the sun rises, but then again, the sun never truly rises on Graveheart. The atmospheric processes that once scrubbed the air clean broke down generations ago, and now the sky hangs like a brown shroud over everything. The hab blocks stretch upward into this perpetual twilight, their facades streaked with rust and chemical runoff that has eaten the imperial eagles carved into the concrete until they look more like screaming birds than symbols of mankind's dominion. From my window on the 47th level, I can see the mining platforms scattered across the Badlands like metal tumors, their extraction towers disappearing into the toxic haze. The shift whistle sounds at 4 in the morning local time, though time itself feels negotiable here. The sound cuts through the hab block walls like a scream, and instantly the corridors fill with the shuffle of boots and the rasp of breathing through rebreather masks. Nobody talks much in the morning. There is nothing to say that has not been said 10,000 times before, and words cost energy that will be needed below. The miners move like sleepwalkers through routines burned into their muscle memory by years of repetition. In the communal wash stations, men and women strip to their underclothes and rinse themselves with recycled water that tastes of metal and desperation. The water is rationed, of course, like everything else on Graveheart. 3 minutes per person, timed by an ancient chronometer that has been counting down lives for longer than anyone remembers. The lucky ones have soap. The unlucky ones scrub themselves with industrial degreasing compound that leaves their skin raw and chemical burned, but at least removes some of the accumulated filth of the mines. I watch them prepare for another day in the depths, and I think about the children who are born here. By imperial law, every citizen of the Imperium is entitled to know the glory of serving the Emperor, but on worlds like Graveheart, that service is predetermined by genetics and geography. The children born in the upper hab levels might become overseers or technical specialists. The children born in the lower levels become miners. There is no social mobility on a mining world, only vertical mobility measured in shaft levels and body counts. The mining equipment is older than the Imperium itself, or at least it feels that way. The excavation suits are heavy, cumbersome things that turn men into metal insects, all grinding servos and pneumatic limbs. They leak hydraulic fluid constantly, and the fluid is mildly toxic, causing skin lesions and respiratory problems that the Medicaid dismisses as occupational hazards. The miners have learned to wrap their exposed skin in whatever cloth they can scavenge, giving them the appearance of walking corpses wrapped in burial shrouds. The descent to the work sites takes 47 minutes on the freight elevators, massive industrial platforms that carry equipment and human cargo with equal indifference. The elevator shafts are cut directly into the rock, and as you descend, you can see the geological history of Graveheart written in the stone layers. Here, an ancient seabed compressed into limestone. There, volcanic deposits from eruptions that occurred when this world still had a living ecosystem. The miners do not look at these things. They have learned not to think about what this planet was before they came to strip it bare. At depth level 7, the temperature rises to 43 degrees Celsius. The air recyclers struggle to keep pace with the heat generated by the mining operations, and the humidity condenses on every surface until the tunnel walls weep constantly. The sound of water dripping mingles with the crash and grind of the excavation machinery to create a rhythm that becomes hypnotic after hours of exposure. Many miners develop a condition the Medicaid calls tunnel syndrome, where they continue to hear the sounds of the mine even when they are on the surface trying to sleep. The work itself is brutal and repetitive. Plasma cutters slice through rock faces, melting stone into slag that cools quickly in the artificial atmosphere. The miners follow behind with extraction equipment, separating the valuable ores from the worthless debris with mechanical precision. The quotas are set by men who have never been below ground, calculated by algorithms that factor in equipment maintenance and replacement worker training, but somehow never account for the human cost of meeting those numbers. Magister Quintus oversees the 7th level operations, and he has been doing so for 38 years. His left arm was replaced by a mechanical prosthetic after a cave-in crushed it during his 2nd year as a miner. His lungs were replaced with augmetic respiratory units after prolonged exposure to airborne toxins left him unable to process oxygen naturally. His eyes were replaced with optical sensors after a plasma cutter malfunction left him blind. He is more machine than man now, but he still considers himself fortunate because he survived long enough to be promoted out of active mining duty. He tells me that the average life expectancy for a new miner on Graveheart is 7.3 years. This statistic includes accidental deaths, equipment malfunctions, toxic exposure, cave-ins, and what the reports diplomatically call sudden cardiovascular failure, which usually means a miner's heart simply stopped beating under the accumulated stress of the work. The statistic does not include suicides, which are officially classified as dereliction of duty and struck from the records. The mining tunnels extend in all directions from the primary shafts, like the branches of some vast underground tree. Some tunnels have been excavated so extensively that they have created caverns large enough to house entire hab blocks. In these spaces, the miners have built unauthorized settlements, crude structures made from discarded mining equipment and salvaged materials. The overseers know about these settlements but tolerate them because it keeps the workers close to the extraction sites and reduces transportation costs. In settlement designation X47, I meet a woman named Cassia who has been mining for 22 years. She started when she was 16. Following her father into the tunnels after he suffered a spinal injury that left him unable to work. Her mother died of lung rot when Cassia was 12, and her younger brother was crushed in a tunnel collapse during his first month as a miner. Cassia has outlived the statistical projections by more than a decade, and the other miners treat her with the reverence usually reserved for imperial saints. She shows me the tools of her trade, worn smooth by decades of use. The plasma cutter is a compact unit that attaches to her forearm, powered by a fusion cell that she carries on her back. The extraction claws are integrated into her gloves, allowing her to separate ore from rock with movements that have become as natural as breathing. Her rebreather mask is a custom unit that she has modified and maintained herself because the standard issue masks fail with predictable regularity and replacement parts are often delayed for weeks or months. The work shifts are 12 hours long, but experienced miners like Cassia often volunteer for double shifts to increase their ore quotas. The payment system is based on individual productivity, measured by weight of extracted materials minus equipment usage and maintenance costs. A good day might yield enough credits to purchase a few extra ration bars or a replacement air filter. A bad day means working without pay to cover the cost of damaged equipment. During the meal break, taken 6 hours into each shift, the miners gather in designated rest areas carved into the tunnel walls. The air here is marginally cleaner, filtered through scrubbers that remove the worst of the toxic particles, but leave behind a metallic taste that coats the inside of the mouth like paint. The miners eat ration bars made from processed protein and synthetic nutrients, washing them down with recycled water that has been purified so many times it has lost any resemblance to natural water. They do not talk about their lives above ground because there is little to discuss. Most miners live in dormitory-style housing, sharing sleeping quarters with 5 or 6 other workers. Privacy is a luxury that mining worlds cannot afford. Personal possessions are limited to what can fit in a footlocker, and even then, valuable items have a tendency to disappear when their owners are working their shifts. The concept of a private life becomes meaningless when every moment is structured around the demands of the extraction quotas. Some miners find solace in religion, and the tunnels echo with whispered prayers to the emperor during the quiet moments between excavation cycles. The prayers are usually requests for protection from cave-ins or equipment failures, but sometimes they are pleas for forgiveness for the things the miners must do to survive. On Graveheart, survival often means allowing others to die, whether through equipment failures that could have been prevented or by remaining silent when safety violations occur. The miners understand that their lives are expendable, but they struggle with the knowledge that they are complicit in their own expendability. The chapel on level 12 was carved by the miners themselves during off-duty hours, a crude but heartfelt shrine decorated with salvaged materials and improvised religious icons. The servo skull that serves as the chapel's audio recorder has been modified to play hymns, though the playback quality is poor and the songs often skip or distort in the middle of verses. The miners do not seem to mind. They sing along with voices roughened by years of breathing toxic air, creating harmonies that echo through the tunnels like the voices of the dead calling from below. Father Matthias conducts services when he can make the descent to the lower levels, though his health has been deteriorating rapidly since his arrival on Graveheart 5 years ago. The combination of poor air quality and the stress of ministering to a population with a 73% mortality rate has left him gaunt and hollow-eyed, with a persistent cough that he tries to hide behind his ceremonial robes. He tells me that he has performed more last rites on Graveheart than in his previous 15 years of service combined. The miners respect Father Matthias, but they do not expect salvation from him or anyone else. They have learned that faith on a mining world is not about hoping for divine intervention, but about finding meaning in suffering that would otherwise be unbearable. The prayers they offer are not requests for rescue, but acknowledgements that their deaths, when they come, will serve the Emperor's purpose by providing the materials needed to build his ships and weapons. As the work shift continues, the temperature rises and the air quality deteriorates. The miners work in rotation, taking turns at the extraction face while others operate the support equipment or haul processed materials to the loading platforms. The work is coordinated with mechanical precision, but there is no room for error or hesitation. A moment's inattention can result in injury or death, not just for the careless worker but for others in the vicinity. The excavation process releases gases trapped in the rock for millennia, some of which are toxic or corrosive. The miners wear atmospheric sensors that alert them to dangerous concentrations, but the sensors are often unreliable, and many miners have learned to identify hazardous conditions by smell, taste, or the way the air feels in their lungs. This knowledge is passed from experienced workers to newcomers through informal mentorship, though the turnover rate means that much valuable information is lost with each generation of miners. At depth level 9, I witness an equipment malfunction that illustrates the casual brutality of life on Graveheart. A hydraulic line ruptures on an excavation suit, spraying superheated fluid across the tunnel wall. The miner inside the suit, a young man named Tobias who has been working the mines for 8 months, is scalded across his back and right arm. The medical response consists of basic first aid administered by his fellow workers, who continue their excavation duties while treating his injuries. Tobias is given a dose of combat stimulants to help him manage the pain, and his burns are covered with regenerative gel that will prevent infection but will not reduce scarring. He is back at work within 2 hours because the medical assessor determines that his injuries do not prevent him from operating his equipment. The incident is recorded in the daily reports as a minor workplace accident requiring no further action. The miners accept these conditions not because they are ignorant of alternatives, but because they understand that alternatives do not exist for people like them. On an agricultural world, they might live longer but face starvation during poor harvests. On a forge world, they might have better medical care but work in conditions that are equally dangerous in different ways. On a hive world, they might have access to entertainment and social mobility, but live in overcrowded conditions with higher crime rates and competition for resources. Graveheart offers its own form of brutal certainty. The work is hard and the life expectancy is low, but the miners know exactly what is expected of them and exactly what they will receive in return. There is honesty in this arrangement that many imperial citizens never experience. The miners are not promised glory or advancement or prosperity. They are promised that their suffering will serve the Emperor, and that promise is kept with mathematical precision. The shift change occurs at the 16-hour mark, as the first crew reaches the limits of safe operation and the second crew takes over the excavation duties. The handover is conducted with military efficiency, as each outgoing miner provides a status report on equipment condition, extraction progress, and any hazards identified during the shift. The incoming miners acknowledge this information with the grim professionalism of soldiers entering a battlefield. The ascent to the surface takes nearly an hour, as the freight elevators are loaded with processed ore that must be transferred to the storage facilities before the miners can be transported. During this time, the miners sit in exhausted silence, their bodies slowly adjusting to the lower temperatures and cleaner air of the upper levels. Some remove their rebreather masks prematurely, desperate for unfiltered air, but this often results in coughing fits as their damaged lungs struggle to process the atmospheric changes. The surface of Graveheart at shift change resembles a vision of the afterlife as described in the most pessimistic Imperial texts. Thousands of miners emerge from dozens of shafts scattered across hundreds of square kilometers, their faces blackened with dust and their bodies bent with exhaustion. They move like the walking dead through the industrial complexes that separate the mining sites from the hab blocks, past machinery that never stops grinding and processing the materials they have extracted from the planet's bones. The hab blocks at the end of shift are filled with the sounds of collective misery, showers running constantly as miners try to wash away the physical residue of their work, coughing echoing through thin walls as damaged lungs struggle to clear themselves of accumulated dust and chemical residue. The quiet sobbing of miners who have reached their psychological breaking point but cannot afford to stop working. The silence of miners who have passed beyond exhaustion into a state of mechanical existence where they perform necessary functions without conscious thought. In the communal dining areas, the miners consume their evening rations with the methodical determination of people who eat not for pleasure but for survival. The food is nutritionally adequate but tastes of chemicals and preservation compounds. Conversation is limited to practical matters like equipment, maintenance, and shift assignments. Personal topics are avoided not from lack of interest but because personal lives are a luxury that mining worlds cannot accommodate. The sleep cycles on Graveheart are disrupted by the 28-hour rotation schedule that keeps the mining operations running continuously. Miners work 4 days and rest for 16 hours, but the rest is rarely peaceful. The hab blocks are never quiet, as returning miners clash with departing miners in the corridors and common areas. The walls are thin and poorly insulated, so every sound carries. The air recycling systems operate with a constant mechanical humming that becomes background noise but never truly disappears. Some miners attempt to create normal lives within these constraints. They form relationships with other workers, though the high mortality rate means that most relationships end in bereavement rather than mutual choice. They collect small possessions that remind them of life beyond the mines, though storage space is limited and valuable items are targets for theft. They maintain correspondence with family members on other worlds, though communications are monitored and censored for security reasons. The children born on Graveheart face predetermined futures with no possibility of escape. Education is limited to basic literacy and numerical skills necessary for mining operations. There are no schools in the traditional sense, only training facilities where children learn to operate the equipment they will use for the rest of their lives. By age 12, most children are working part-time shifts to supplement family income. By age 16, they are full-time miners with the same life expectancy as their parents. The medical facilities on Graveheart are designed for triage rather than treatment. The Medicae staff focus on keeping miners functional enough to work rather than providing comprehensive health care. Injuries that do not prevent work are ignored. Injuries that prevent work are treated quickly and cheaply. Injuries that require expensive treatment are classified as terminal conditions, and the affected miners are transferred to palliative care facilities where they wait to die. Medicae Surgeon Vex has been stationed on Graveheart for 12 years, and his case logs provide insight into the long-term effects of life on a mining world. Respiratory damage is universal among long-term miners, ranging from minor scarring to complete lung failure. Skeletal damage is common due to the weight of mining equipment and the physical stress of working in confined spaces. Neurological damage occurs frequently due to exposure to industrial chemicals and the psychological stress of high-mortality work environments. The psychological profiles of long-term miners show consistent patterns of emotional numbing, social withdrawal, and what the Medicae classifies as adaptive fatalism. The miners develop coping mechanisms that allow them to function in an environment where death is statistically inevitable, but these same mechanisms prevent them from forming meaningful relationships or planning for futures they do not expect to see. The mining equipment itself becomes a character in the lives of the workers as they develop relationships with machines that are more consistent and reliable than human relationships. Experienced miners can diagnose equipment problems by sound and feel, adjusting their work patterns to accommodate mechanical limitations. They personify their tools, giving them names and treating them with care that extends beyond mere maintenance requirements. The excavation suits become extensions of the miners' bodies, mechanical exoskeletons that amplify human strength but limit human flexibility. The suits are designed for efficiency rather than comfort, and prolonged use causes joint pain, muscle atrophy, and circulation problems. The miners accept these problems as inevitable consequences of their work, like soldiers accept battle scars as proof of their service to the emperor. The deeper levels of the mining complex reveal the true scale of Graveheart's transformation from living planet to industrial resource. At depth level 15, the excavation has reached pre-human archaeological deposits, layers of rock that contain fossilized remains of the planet's original ecosystem. The miners work around these discoveries without acknowledgement, as their contracts specify that their job is extraction, not exploration or preservation. Some of the fossils are beautiful, preserved remnants of creatures that lived on Graveheart when it had oceans and forests and breathable atmosphere. The miners occasionally pause to look at these glimpses of what their world once was, but they do not discuss what they see. There is no room in their mental framework for grief over the loss of something they never experienced. Their relationship with Graveheart is purely extractive, and sentimentality is a luxury they cannot afford. The mining operations have reached a depth where geothermal activity provides natural heating, but also creates hazards that require constant monitoring. Pockets of superheated gas can erupt without warning, and underground water sources can turn to steam instantly when breached by excavation equipment. The miners work with the casual competence of people who have learned to navigate deadly hazards as part of their daily routine. At this depth, the rock formations contain minerals that are valuable enough to justify the increased risk and operational cost. Rare earth elements used in the construction of Imperial warships, radioactive isotopes required for plasma weapon manufacturing, crystalline structures that serve as components in astropathic communication devices. The miners extract these materials without understanding their purpose or significance, focusing only on meeting their quotas and surviving their shifts. The transport systems that carry processed materials to the surface are marvels of industrial engineering, massive conveyor systems and pneumatic tubes that move tons of ore continuously. The miners who maintain these systems work in conditions that are even more dangerous than the excavation sites, as they must access moving machinery while it operates. The maintenance schedules are calculated to maximize operational efficiency, which means that safety margins are minimal and equipment failures are often fatal. The administrative levels of the mining complex are staffed by Imperial bureaucrats who never descend below level 3. These men and women process the reports and quotas and efficiency calculations that determine how the mining operations are conducted, but they have no direct experience with the conditions their decisions create. The disconnect between policy and practice is absolute, and the miners understand that their lives are governed by people who view them as production statistics rather than human beings. Supervisor Corvin reviews the daily reports from his office on Level 2, surrounded by data displays that show production figures, equipment status, and personnel statistics. The numbers tell a story of consistent productivity and acceptable loss rates, but they do not convey the human cost of maintaining those statistics. Corvin has held his position for 6 years, and during that time, the mining operations under his supervision have maintained a profitability rating that earns commendations from his superiors on distant worlds. The miners know Supervisor Corvin by reputation only, as he never interacts with them directly. His decisions affect their lives in countless ways, from work schedules to equipment allocation to safety protocols, but he remains an abstract figure whose existence is confirmed only by the policy memos that filter down through the command structure. The miners understand that they are governed by invisible forces that view them as expendable resources, and they accept this arrangement because rebellion would be both futile and counterproductive. The social structure of Graveheart is determined entirely by proximity to the mining operations. The closer to the extraction sites, the lower the social status and the higher the mortality rate. The surface facilities house the administrative staff and technical specialists who manage the mining operations but do not directly participate in them. The intermediate levels house the supervisors and skilled workers who oversee the mining activities. The deepest levels house the miners themselves, the expendable workforce whose lives are measured in production quotas rather than human potential. This stratification is enforced not by law or regulation but by the practical necessities of the mining operations. The people with valuable skills and knowledge must be protected because they are difficult to replace. The people who perform manual labor are easily replaced and therefore not worth protecting. The miners understand this logic and accept it, because fighting against inevitable social structures wastes energy that is needed for survival. The communication systems on Graveheart are designed to facilitate industrial coordination rather than personal connection. Messages between levels of the mining complex are filtered through supervisory channels that monitor content for security violations and productivity concerns. Personal communications with family members on other worlds are limited and subject to censorship. The miners live in functional isolation, connected to each other through shared work experiences but cut off from the broader human community of the Imperium. The propaganda systems that operate throughout the mining complex provide constant reminders of the miners' service to the Emperor, but the messages are generic and impersonal. Images of imperial glory and quotes from the ecclesiarchy play on screens in common areas and work sites, but they have no relevance to the daily reality of mining operations. The miners ignore these displays because they understand that the propaganda is intended for people who have choices, and miners have no choices. The security forces on Graveheart consist of a small detachment of Imperial Guard veterans who maintain order through the threat of violence rather than active enforcement. The crime rate among the miners is low, not because they are naturally law-abiding but because they lack the time and energy for criminal activity. The security forces focus primarily on preventing sabotage of the mining equipment and ensuring that production quotas are met on schedule. The few incidents of civil unrest that occur on Graveheart are handled with overwhelming force and used as examples to discourage future problems. The miners who participate in work stoppages or protests are transferred to the most dangerous work assignments, where their life expectancy drops from the standard 7 years to approximately 6 months. The other miners witness these consequences and adjust their behavior accordingly. The mining operations on Graveheart operate according to cycles that are determined by imperial logistics rather than planetary conditions. When the demand for certain materials increases due to military campaigns or construction projects, the mining quotas are adjusted upward and the miners work longer shifts at higher productivity levels. When demand decreases, the quotas are reduced but the workforce is not, leading to increased competition for assignments and reduced income for individual miners. These economic cycles create boom and bust periods that affect every aspect of life on Graveheart. During boom periods, the miners work themselves to exhaustion but earn enough credits to improve their living conditions marginally. During bust periods, the miners struggle to meet basic survival needs, and the mortality rate increases as malnutrition and stress take their toll. The cycles are predictable in their general pattern, but unpredictable in their specific timing, creating chronic anxiety among the mining population. The environmental damage caused by the mining operations has reached a point where it affects the planetary ecosystem in measurable ways. The atmospheric processes cannot keep pace with the pollutants released by the extraction processes, leading to acid rain that corrodes the surface infrastructure and makes outdoor work increasingly dangerous. The groundwater has been contaminated by mining chemicals, requiring all drinking water to be processed through expensive filtration systems. The miners understand that they are destroying their own world, but they also understand that they have no alternative. The Imperium demands resources, and Graveheart exists to provide those resources. The long-term consequences of environmental destruction are irrelevant compared to the short-term necessity of meeting production quotas. The miners are participants in their own planetary suicide, but they are also prisoners of economic and political forces beyond their control. The cultural life of Graveheart is limited to the customs and traditions that can survive in an industrial environment focused entirely on resource extraction. Music exists in the form of work songs that help coordinate group activities and provide psychological comfort during difficult shifts. Art exists in the form of decorative modifications to equipment and living spaces, small gestures of individual creativity within the constraints of collective functionality. Literature exists primarily in the form of technical manuals and safety instructions, though some miners maintain collections of printed materials smuggled from other worlds. These books and documents are treated as precious objects, shared carefully among trusted friends and preserved with the dedication usually reserved for religious relics. The act of reading becomes a form of resistance against the dehumanizing effects of industrial labor, a reminder that miners are human beings with interior lives that extend beyond their work functions. The religious practices on Graveheart blend imperial doctrine with folk traditions that have developed specifically in response to the conditions of mining life. The miners pray for protection from cave-ins and equipment failures, but they also perform rituals designed to appease the spirit of the planet itself. These rituals are not officially sanctioned by the ecclesiarchy, but they are tolerated because they improve morale and do not interfere with production schedules. The concept of time on Graveheart becomes distorted by the constant artificial lighting and the irregular shift schedules. The miners lose touch with natural circadian rhythms, leading to sleep disorders and psychological disorientation. The passage of days and weeks becomes meaningless when every period of wakefulness is identical and every period of rest is interrupted by industrial noise. The miners measure time by production cycles rather than calendar dates, and their sense of personal history becomes fragmented and unreliable. The death rate on Graveheart is so high that the disposal of bodies becomes a logistical challenge requiring industrial-scale solutions. The miners who die from accidents or disease are processed through cremation facilities that operate continuously, their ashes scattered in designated areas that have been exhausted of mineral resources. The cremation process is efficient but impersonal, with multiple bodies processed simultaneously and no ceremonies or rituals to acknowledge individual lives. The families of deceased miners receive notification through official channels, but the messages are standardized forms that provide no details about the circumstances of death or the contribution the deceased made to the mining operations. The miners understand that their deaths will be anonymous and unmourned except by their immediate work colleagues, and they make peace with this knowledge because the alternative is psychological breakdown that would prevent them from functioning. The replacement workers who arrive on Graveheart to fill the positions of deceased miners come from other imperial worlds where economic conditions are even worse than those on mining worlds. They arrive with hopes for stable employment and adequate living conditions, but these hopes are quickly adjusted to match the reality of their situation. The veterans watch the newcomers undergo this psychological transformation with mixture of sympathy and resignation. The training program for new miners is designed for efficiency rather than comprehensiveness, focusing on basic safety procedures and production techniques, while ignoring the psychological preparation needed for long-term survival in the mining environment. The new miners learn through experience that their official training provided only a fraction of the knowledge they need to survive, and they must acquire the rest through informal mentorship and painful trial and error. The equipment failures that occur regularly in the mining operations are often preventable, but prevention requires maintenance resources that are allocated based on cost-benefit analyses rather than safety considerations. The miners learn to work with partially functional equipment because fully functional equipment is a luxury that mining worlds cannot afford. They develop improvisational skills that allow them to complete their work assignments despite mechanical problems that would shut down operations in environments where human life is valued more highly than production efficiency. The communication between the mining levels and the surface administration occurs through a bureaucratic hierarchy that filters information according to the perceived needs of each organizational level. The miners report problems and hazards to their immediate supervisors, who evaluate these reports according to their potential impact on production schedules. Information that might require expensive solutions or production delays is often classified as low priority or dismissed entirely. The miners understand that they cannot rely on the administrative hierarchy to address their concerns, so they develop informal networks for sharing information and coordinating responses to dangerous conditions. These networks operate outside official channels and focus on practical survival rather than bureaucratic procedure. The miners know that their lives depend on their ability to protect each other because the official safety systems are designed to protect equipment and production schedules rather than human beings. The medical treatment available to miners is limited to interventions that can restore work capacity quickly and cheaply. Chronic conditions that develop slowly over years of exposure to mining hazards are treated with pain management rather than curative therapy, because curative therapy would be expensive and would not increase productivity. The miners develop tolerance for levels of pain and disability that would be considered unacceptable in other imperial populations, because they understand that their value is determined by their ability to work rather than their overall health and well-being. The psychological counseling services on Graveheart are provided by ecclesiarchy personnel who focus on spiritual guidance rather than mental health treatment. The miners are encouraged to find meaning in their suffering by viewing it as service to the Emperor, but they are not provided with practical coping strategies or emotional support. The counseling sessions are often group events that emphasize collective duty rather than individual needs, reinforcing the message that personal concerns are less important than production requirements. The social relationships that develop among the miners are characterized by intense loyalty combined with emotional distance, as people form strong bonds based on shared hardship while protecting themselves from the pain of inevitable loss. Friendships are measured in terms of practical support and mutual protection rather than emotional intimacy. The miners care deeply about their colleagues but avoid expressing this care in ways that would make the loss of those colleagues more difficult to bear. The family structures on Graveheart are adapted to the high mortality rate and the demands of continuous mining operations. Children are raised collectively by adults who are available rather than by their biological parents exclusively. Marriages are informal arrangements that provide mutual support and companionship, but are not expected to last for extended periods. The concept of long-term family planning becomes meaningless when the average life expectancy is measured in years rather than decades. The educational system on Graveheart is focused entirely on job training, with no provision for general knowledge or cultural education. Children learn reading and mathematics only to the extent necessary for interpreting technical manuals and calculating production quotas. They learn history only in the form of simplified imperial propaganda that emphasizes duty and obedience. They learn nothing about art, literature, philosophy, or any subject that might encourage them to question their predetermined role as mining workers. The recreational activities available to miners are limited to those that can be pursued during brief rest periods and do not require expensive equipment or facilities. Gambling is popular because it provides excitement and the possibility of financial gain without requiring significant time investment. Physical competitions are popular because they allow miners to demonstrate skills and strength that have practical applications in their work. Intellectual activities are rare because they require mental energy that is needed for survival. The technological systems that support the mining operations are a mixture of advanced imperial equipment and jury-rigged modifications designed to extend the operational life of failing machinery. The miners become skilled at improvising solutions to technical problems because replacement parts are often unavailable for months at a time. They learn to repair complex systems using salvaged components and creative engineering, developing expertise that would be valuable in other contexts but has no application outside the mining environment. The transportation networks that connect Graveheart to other Imperial worlds operate on schedules determined by logistics requirements rather than the needs of the local population. Supply ships arrive irregularly, bringing replacement equipment and new workers while taking away processed materials and the bodies of miners who have requested transfer to off-world medical facilities. The miners understand that they are part of an interstellar economic system that views them as replaceable components rather than human beings with inherent value. The political structure of Graveheart is determined entirely by imperial administrative requirements, with no provision for local self-governance or democratic participation. The miners have no influence over the policies that govern their lives, and they understand that political activism would be both futile and dangerous. They focus their energy on survival and productivity rather than political change, because they understand that the system they live within is designed to be unchangeable. The environmental conditions on Graveheart continue to deteriorate as the mining operations expand deeper into the planet's core and higher into the atmosphere. The air quality requires constant monitoring and filtration, but the filtration systems are overloaded and frequently malfunction. The water supply is contaminated with industrial chemicals that cause long-term health problems but are not immediately fatal. The soil is saturated with toxic compounds that prevent any form of agriculture or natural ecosystem recovery. The miners witness this environmental destruction daily, but they also understand that their economic survival depends on continuing the activities that cause the destruction. They are trapped in a system where their short-term survival requires them to eliminate the possibility of long-term survival for their children and grandchildren. The psychological stress of this contradiction contributes to the high rates of depression and anxiety among the mining population. The mining operations on Graveheart have reached a point where they are extracting materials faster than geological processes can replace them, meaning that the planet's mineral resources are being depleted in a way that cannot be reversed. The miners understand that they are working themselves out of a job, but they also understand that stopping work would mean immediate starvation rather than eventual unemployment. They continue to dig deeper and work harder because the alternative to gradual planetary exhaustion is immediate personal extinction. The cultural memory of what Graveheart was like before the mining operations began is preserved only in fragmentary stories told by the oldest miners, who arrived during the early phases of industrial development. These stories describe a world that was harsh and barely habitable but still recognizably alive, with weather patterns and seasonal changes and indigenous life forms. The younger miners listen to these stories with the same mixture of fascination and disbelief that previous generations might have reserved for fairy tales. The relationship between the miners and the planet itself has evolved into something resembling a parasitic infection, where the human population survives by consuming the host organism until both parasite and host are destroyed. The miners understand this relationship but cannot change it, because changing it would require political and economic power that they do not possess. They continue to strip away the planet's substance because they have no other options for survival. The mining equipment becomes increasingly sophisticated as the operations reach deeper levels and encounter more challenging extraction conditions, but the sophistication of the equipment is not matched by improvements in working conditions or safety standards. The advanced machinery requires more skilled operators, but the training programs remain focused on basic competency rather than comprehensive understanding. The miners learn to operate complex systems without understanding the principles behind their function, making them dependent on technical specialists who may not be available during emergencies. The deeper extraction sites reveal geological formations that have been undisturbed for millions of years, and occasionally the miners encounter voids and caverns that contain unexpected phenomena. Some caverns are filled with crystalline formations that interfere with communications equipment. Others contain gas pockets under pressure that can cause explosive decompression when breached. The most disturbing discoveries are the caverns that contain evidence of previous mining operations, suggesting that Graveheart has been exploited and abandoned multiple times throughout its history. The miners who work at the deepest levels develop a form of psychological adaptation that allows them to function in an environment that would be unbearable to surface dwellers. They learn to work in complete darkness, punctuated only by the lights on their equipment. They become accustomed to the constant pressure and heat that would cause panic attacks in people with normal psychological conditioning. They develop an almost supernatural ability to navigate the tunnel systems by sound and feel rather than visual reference. The social dynamics among the deep-level miners are different from those who work closer to the surface. The extreme conditions create bonds that are stronger than family relationships, as survival depends absolutely on the competence and reliability of work partners. The deep-level miners develop their own informal governance systems, making decisions collectively about work assignments and safety procedures without consulting the surface administration. They understand that they are beyond the reach of normal supervisory oversight and must take responsibility for their own survival. The communication systems at the deepest levels are unreliable due to geological interference and the extreme distances involved in transmitting signals to the surface. The miners work for hours at a time without contact with supervisory personnel, making independent decisions about extraction procedures and safety protocols. This independence comes with increased responsibility but also increased risk, as help may not be available if equipment failures or accidents occur. The materials extracted from the deepest levels are often more valuable than those found near the surface, but they are also more dangerous to handle. Some ores are radioactive and require specialized containment procedures that the miners learn through trial and error. Other materials are chemically reactive and can cause fires or toxic gas releases if not handled properly. The miners develop expertise in dealing with these hazardous materials, but they also suffer long-term health consequences that may not become apparent for years after exposure. The psychological pressure of working at extreme depth affects different miners in different ways. Some develop claustrophobia that makes it impossible to continue working in confined spaces. Others develop agoraphobia that makes it impossible to function on the surface. A few develop a condition that the Medicae calls depth addiction, where they become psychologically dependent on the extreme environment and cannot function normally at higher levels. The equipment maintenance requirements at the deepest levels are more complex and time-consuming than those at surface operations, but the maintenance schedules are still determined by production targets rather than equipment longevity. The miners learn to perform maintenance tasks while the equipment is still operating, exposing themselves to additional risks in order to avoid production delays. They develop skills in emergency repair that would be valuable in other contexts, but these skills are learned at the cost of frequent injuries and constant stress. The environmental conditions at the deepest levels approach the limits of human survival even with protective equipment. The temperature exceeds 50 degrees Celsius in some areas, and the humidity approaches 100%. The air pressure is significantly higher than surface normal, causing physical discomfort and respiratory problems. The miners who work at these levels undergo gradual physiological changes that adapt them to the extreme conditions but make it difficult for them to function normally when they return to the surface. The shift rotations for deep-level work are shorter than those for surface operations, but they are also more frequent. The miners work 6-hour shifts followed by 12-hour rest periods, but the rest periods are often interrupted by emergency calls or equipment failures. The irregular schedule disrupts normal sleep patterns and makes it difficult to maintain personal relationships or engage in recreational activities. The food and water requirements for deep-level miners are different from those who work closer to the surface, as the extreme conditions increase caloric needs and dehydration rates. The miners consume high-energy rations and electrolyte supplements, but these are expensive and often in short supply. Dehydration and malnutrition are constant concerns, and some miners develop eating disorders as they struggle to balance their nutritional needs with the limited resources available. The medical emergencies that occur at the deepest levels are often fatal because emergency response times are measured in hours rather than minutes. The miners learn basic medical skills and carry emergency supplies, but they understand that serious injuries or medical conditions will likely be fatal if they occur during a deep-level shift. This knowledge affects their decision-making and risk assessment, as they must balance productivity requirements against survival considerations. The tunnel systems at the deepest levels form a three-dimensional maze that would be impossible to navigate without experience and specialized knowledge. The miners develop mental maps of the tunnel networks, but these maps are constantly changing as new excavations are completed and old tunnels collapse or flood. Getting lost in the deep-level tunnels is often fatal, as rescue operations are difficult and time-consuming. The extraction quotas for deep-level operations are higher than those for surface work, reflecting the increased value of the materials being extracted and the higher operational costs involved. The miners who work at these levels are under constant pressure to maintain productivity despite the challenging conditions. The pressure comes not only from supervisory personnel but also from the knowledge that deep-level positions are highly sought after because of the increased pay, and poor performance can result in reassignment to less desirable work locations. The waste products generated by deep-level mining operations are more toxic and difficult to dispose of than those from surface operations. Some waste materials must be stored in sealed containers and transported to specialized disposal facilities. Other waste products are too dangerous to transport and must be buried in designated areas within the mine complex. The miners who handle these materials are exposed to additional health risks, but they are also eligible for hazard pay that can significantly increase their income. The geological instability at the deepest levels creates constant risk of cave-ins and structural failures that can kill miners instantly or trap them in areas where rescue is impossible. The miners learn to read the warning signs of impending collapse, but the signs are not always reliable, and the pressure to maintain production quotas often forces them to continue working in areas they know are dangerous. The machinery used at the deepest levels generates noise levels that cause permanent hearing damage despite protective equipment. The constant exposure to high-decibel industrial sounds creates a form of sensory deprivation, as the miners lose the ability to distinguish between different types of sounds. This hearing loss affects their ability to detect equipment malfunctions and safety hazards, creating additional risks that compound over time. The lighting systems at the deepest levels are insufficient for normal human visual function, creating an environment where miners must work primarily by feel and sound rather than sight. The inadequate lighting is a cost-saving measure, as providing full illumination at extreme depth would require expensive electrical systems and increased power generation. The miners adapt to working in near darkness, but this adaptation comes at the cost of increased accident rates and psychological stress. The air circulation systems at the deepest levels struggle to maintain breathable atmosphere, and some work areas have oxygen levels that are barely sufficient for human survival. The miners work shorter shifts in these areas, but they also work more shifts to compensate for the reduced productivity. The chronic oxygen deprivation causes fatigue, cognitive impairment, and long-term health problems that affect the miners' ability to function both at work and during their rest periods. The social isolation experienced by deep-level miners is more severe than that experienced by surface workers, as the extreme working conditions limit their ability to interact with miners from other levels. The deep-level miners form tight-knit groups that provide mutual support and companionship, but they also become disconnected from the broader mining community. This isolation can lead to the development of subcultures with their own customs, languages, and social norms that differ significantly from those of the surface population. The transportation systems that carry materials from the deepest levels to the surface are engineering marvels that operate under extreme conditions, but they are also potential death traps if they malfunction while carrying human passengers. The miners who work at the deepest levels must trust their lives to mechanical systems that are constantly stressed beyond their design parameters. Equipment failures during transport can result in deaths that are particularly horrific because they occur over extended periods as the victims are carried slowly toward the surface. The administrative oversight of deep-level operations is minimal because of the communication difficulties and the technical complexity of the work being performed. The miners operate with significant autonomy, making decisions about production procedures and safety protocols based on their local knowledge and immediate conditions. This autonomy allows them to adapt quickly to changing circumstances, but it also means that mistakes or poor judgment can have catastrophic consequences. The career progression for miners who work at the deepest levels is limited because the skills they develop are highly specialized and not transferable to other types of work. The deep-level miners become experts in their specific environment, but this expertise traps them in positions that have extremely high mortality rates. They cannot move to safer work assignments without accepting significant reductions in pay and status, and they often cannot function effectively in less extreme environments due to their physiological and psychological adaptations. The equipment replacement cycles for deep-level operations are longer than those for surface work because of the difficulty and expense of transporting new machinery to extreme depths. The miners work with equipment that is often obsolete and prone to failure, requiring constant improvisation and repair work to maintain functionality. The mechanical skills developed through this necessity are impressive, but they are learned at the cost of frequent injuries and exposure to additional hazards. The environmental monitoring at the deepest levels is limited by the harsh conditions and the difficulty of maintaining sensitive instruments in the extreme environment. The miners rely on crude measurement techniques and their own sensory observations to detect dangerous conditions, but these methods are not always reliable. Gas leaks, structural weaknesses, and other hazards may go undetected until they cause accidents or fatalities. The waste heat generated by the mining operations at the deepest levels creates thermal conditions that approach the limits of human tolerance, even with protective equipment. The miners work in environments where the ambient temperature exceeds normal human body temperature, causing constant stress on their physiological systems. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke are common, and some miners develop chronic conditions related to prolonged exposure to extreme temperatures. The psychological effects of working in an environment that is completely isolated from natural light, weather, and seasonal changes are profound and cumulative. The deep-level miners lose connection with the normal rhythms of planetary life, and many develop depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems. The lack of psychological support services means that these problems are often addressed through informal peer counseling or ignored until they become severe enough to affect work performance. The camaraderie among deep-level miners is intense but also fragile, as the high mortality rate means that close friendships are frequently ended by death or injury. The miners form strong emotional bonds but also develop defense mechanisms that allow them to cope with constant loss. The emotional toll of repeatedly losing friends and colleagues contributes to the psychological problems that are common among the deep-level mining population. The final descent to the deepest operational level takes place in specially modified elevators that can withstand the extreme pressure and temperature conditions. The descent takes more than 2 hours, during which the miners must gradually acclimatize to the changing environmental conditions. The ascent at the end of a shift takes equally long, and many miners experience physical and psychological disorientation during the transition between the extreme deep-level environment and the relatively normal conditions at the surface. At the absolute deepest level of the mining complex, level 23, the operation has become something that resembles archaeological excavation more than traditional mining. The geological formations at this depth contain materials and structures that predate human civilization, and occasionally the miners encounter artifacts or phenomena that cannot be explained by conventional scientific understanding. These discoveries are reported to the Surface Administration but are usually classified and removed by specialists who arrive from off-world locations. The miners who work at level 23 are a select group who have survived long enough to develop the skills and psychological resilience necessary for work in the most extreme conditions. They are treated with respect and fear by the miners from higher levels, who view them as being somehow beyond normal human limitations. The level 23 miners understand that they are living on borrowed time, as the mortality rate at this depth approaches 100% over extended periods. But they continue to work because they have become psychologically and physiologically adapted to conditions that would be instantly fatal to normal humans. The extraction procedures at level 23 require techniques that have been developed specifically for this environment and have no application anywhere else. The materials being extracted are unlike anything found at higher levels, and they require specialized handling and processing procedures that are known only to the miners who work at this depth. The knowledge and experience accumulated by these miners represents decades of trial and error, experimentation, and survival, but it dies with them because the conditions are too extreme to allow for normal training and knowledge transfer procedures. The equipment used at level 23 is custom modified and hand-built by the miners themselves, as no standard industrial equipment can function reliably under these conditions. The miners have become skilled engineers and inventors by necessity, creating tools and machines that solve problems that exist nowhere else in human experience. Their innovations are often brilliant and effective, but they are also jury-rigged solutions that work only in the specific context of level 23 operations. The work shifts at level 23 are irregular and determined by the miners themselves based on their assessment of conditions and their physical and psychological state. The surface administration has given up trying to impose normal scheduling procedures at this depth, recognizing that the miners who work here have expertise that cannot be replicated and judgment that must be trusted. The level 23 miners work when conditions permit and rest when conditions require, following rhythms that are determined by the planet itself, rather than by human administrative convenience. The materials extracted from level 23 are processed on-site using equipment that the miners have built and maintained themselves. The processing procedures are closely guarded secrets known only to the miners who perform them, as outside interference could disrupt operations that have taken years to perfect. The finished products are transported to the surface through special channels that bypass the normal administrative oversight, reflecting the recognition that level 23 operations require unique handling procedures. The psychological state of the miners who work at level 23 is difficult to assess using normal criteria, as they have adapted to conditions that would cause immediate psychological breakdown in normal humans. They display behavioral patterns that might be considered symptoms of mental illness in other contexts, but which represent functional adaptations to their extreme environment. They communicate primarily through gestures and abbreviated verbal codes that are incomprehensible to outsiders, and they have developed social customs that reflect their unique living conditions. The living quarters for level 23 miners are located within the worksite itself, as the time and energy required for transportation to higher levels would make normal shift rotations impossible. The miners have created living spaces that are functional but bizarre by normal standards, using materials and techniques that reflect their deep understanding of the local environment. Their living arrangements are communal by necessity, as individual privacy is a luxury that cannot be maintained under these conditions. The medical care available to level 23 miners consists entirely of what they can provide for themselves, as normal medical personnel cannot function at this depth, and the miners cannot be transported to medical facilities without risking their lives. The miners have developed medical knowledge and techniques that are specific to their environment and their physiological adaptations. They treat injuries and illnesses using improvised procedures and salvaged materials, achieving results that would be considered miraculous if they occurred in normal medical contexts. The relationship between the level 23 miners and the surface administration is one of mutual dependence combined with mutual incomprehension. The administration needs the materials that only these miners can extract, but they cannot understand or control the methods used to extract them. The miners need the resources and support that only the administration can provide, but they operate according to principles that are incompatible with normal administrative procedures. The level 23 miners understand that they are engaged in an activity that is slowly killing them, but they also understand that they are the only humans capable of performing this work. They continue because they have become psychologically committed to the completion of their task, whatever that task might ultimately prove to be. They work not for money or advancement or recognition, but because they have become part of the planet itself, and stopping would mean abandoning their own identity. The final shift change at level 23 occurs not according to any schedule, but when the miners determine that they have reached the limits of their endurance. The replacement miners descend from level 22, knowing that they are entering an environment that will change them permanently and probably kill them eventually. The ascent of the exhausted miners is a journey that takes them through 22 levels of gradually normalizing conditions, each level representing a step back toward ordinary human experience. The surface of Graveheart at the end of a deep level shift appears almost alien to miners who have spent weeks working at extreme depth. The natural light, even filtered through the polluted atmosphere, seems impossibly bright. The normal air pressure feels thin and insubstantial. The sounds of surface operations seem muted and distant. The miners who have worked at the deepest levels require days or weeks to readjust to surface conditions, and some never fully readjust. The materials extracted from level 23 are shipped off-world without explanation or ceremony, loaded onto transport vessels that arrive on irregular schedules and depart immediately after loading is completed. The miners never learn the purpose or destination of their work product, understanding only that it is valuable enough to justify the extreme costs and risks of deep-level extraction. They work in service to purposes they cannot comprehend, for people they will never meet, in support of causes they will never understand. The mining operations on Graveheart have reached a point where they have become self-perpetuating, continuing not because they serve any rational, economic, or strategic purpose, but because they have acquired their own momentum. The miners work because they have always worked. The administrators issue orders because they have always issued orders. The materials are extracted and shipped because they have always been extracted and shipped. The system continues to function because no one has the authority or the will to stop it. The planet itself seems to have developed a form of passive resistance to the mining operations as geological instabilities increase and equipment failures become more frequent and more severe. The miners understand that Graveheart is fighting back in the only way it can, trying to stop the extraction process by making it too dangerous and expensive to continue. But the miners also understand that they cannot stop, because stopping would mean admitting that their lives and their suffering have been meaningless. The children born on Graveheart in the most recent generation will never know a world that exists for any purpose other than resource extraction. They will never see clean air or natural light or living ecosystems. They will never have the opportunity to choose their own futures or pursue their own interests. They will live and die in service to a system that views them as expendable components in an industrial process that has no beginning and no end. The miners who work the deepest levels understand that they are witnesses to the final phase of their planet's existence as a living world. They are participants in a transformation that will leave Graveheart as nothing more than an empty shell, a hollow sphere of worthless rock drifting in space as a monument to the insatiable appetite of human civilization. They continue to work not because they believe their work is good or necessary, but because they have lost the ability to imagine any alternative. The morning whistle sounds again, as it has sounded every day for generations, calling the miners to another shift in the depths. They rise from their beds and prepare their equipment and descend into the darkness, carrying with them the accumulated weight of their choices and their circumstances and their unspoken understanding that they are complicit in the destruction of the only world they have ever known. In the deepest tunnels of Graveheart, where the air is thick with dust and the walls weep acid condensation, the miners continue to dig. They follow veins of precious ore through geological formations that have remained unchanged for millions of years. They extract materials that will be used to build weapons and ships and monuments to human achievement, knowing that their contribution will never be acknowledged and their sacrifice will never be remembered. The planet shudders beneath their feet as explosives detonate in distant tunnels, and the miners pause in their work to listen to the echoes of destruction reverberating through the stone. They understand that each explosion brings them closer to the moment when the extraction will be complete and Graveheart will have nothing left to give. They understand that when that moment comes, They will be abandoned like the exhausted equipment and the empty tunnels and all the other things that have outlived their usefulness. But until that moment arrives, they continue to work. They continue to dig deeper and extract more, driven by quotas and schedules and the simple need to survive another day. They continue because continuation is the only choice they have ever been given, and because they have learned that hope is a luxury that mining worlds cannot afford. The story of Graveheart is not unique in the vast expanse of the Imperium. Across thousands of worlds, millions of miners descend into the darkness each day to extract the materials that keep human civilization functioning. They live and die in anonymity, their individual stories lost in the statistical reports and production summaries that document their collective contribution to the Emperor's glory. But on this particular world, in these particular tunnels, at this particular moment in the history of human expansion across the galaxy, the miners of Graveheart continue their work. They continue because they must, and because they cannot imagine any alternative, and because someone must pay the price for the Imperium's endless hunger for resources and expansion and dominance. The tunnels echo with the sound of their labor, a rhythm that has become the heartbeat of a dying world. And in that rhythm, in that constant grinding and digging and extracting, lies the truth about what it means to serve the Emperor in the darkness beneath the ground, where the light of his glory never reaches, and where the only reward for faithful service is the promise of more faithful service until death finally provides release.